Hello, everyone, and welcome to Equitable Philanthropy, a conversation with Edgar Villanueva. We're going to be talking about decolonizing wealth today. Decolonizing Wealth is a beautifully written and honest portrayal of the colonial attitudes that are present in philanthropy today and also the finance sector writ large, with an analysis on how the philanthropic dollars can better support and center the needs of Indigenous people and communities of color. ACE is hosting this conversation as part of our own journey to dismantling the traits of white dominant culture in our work and practicing speaking truth to power, as many of our funders and donors join this conversation today. I'm going to start off with a quote. Our communities are in mourning. We mourn the murders of Black people and reel from the spike in police violence against justified outrage. The time for empty solidarity statements has passed. Philanthropy must take accountable action and release an unprecedented amount of unrestricted funds to fuel long-term Black-led movements for racial justice. This moment requires absolutely nothing less if we profess to be dedicated to justice. Edgar Villanueva, June 2020. Hi, my name is Leah Qusba. My pronouns are she, her. I'm ACE's executive director. I'm based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on the occupied land of the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Menominee, Miami, Sioux, and Peoria people. ACE has a mission to educate young people on the science of climate change and to empower them to take action. We seek to both educate a generation of young people about the climate crisis and to increase their access to the vote, to elect leaders who will prioritize swift and equitable climate action at all levels of our society. This is our community of 300,000 plus young people in all 50 states, of whom 53% identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, 68% young women, and 25% Latinx. As you might imagine, right now in the lead up to November, ACE is very focused on a campaign to engage, register, and turn out young climate voters at a large scale and in the communities where their ballots can have a disproportionately high impact. As such, we have launched a coalition of partners across our key states, and we're supporting them with creative tools and training and shared research to get out the youth climate vote this November. We've adapted our plans and we're moving forward despite COVID-19 with plans to reach millions of young people with tools and messages to register online and vote safely from home. Why? Because in 2020, young people have had enough excuses. They've had enough thousand-year floods. We've had enough theft of our future. When will our lives be enough? In 2020, youth votes will be enough to demand a climate plan that meets the urgency of science, or we've had enough of them too. So why today? Why are we discussing equitable philanthropy today? Because it's a privilege to have the freedom to choose when we do or don't have conversations on equity in philanthropy. Decentering our own comfort at ACE and as a community means having these conversations, whether it's convenient timing for us or not. So in the midst of compounding crises from systemic racism to COVID-19 to climate change spiraling out of control unchecked, working to dismantle the traits of white dominant culture and colonialism in our organizations has never been more urgent or important. The time is now, and this is the work. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge where we are as a community. In 2014, just 7.4% of all philanthropic dollars were given to BIPOC community efforts. Foundation funding focused on reaching these communities has never exceeded 8.5%, and the proportion of money given specifically to African Americans and Natives actually decreased between 2005 and 2014. Finally, despite changing demographics and increased societal awareness of the impacts of systemic racism, there has been virtually no progress on expanding funding in response. We acknowledge our own work that we need to do at ACE. We are an organization with a multiracial staff that identifies as a majority Black, Indigenous, and people of color, yet our executive leadership team lags behind at just 43% BIPOC. Our board, 22% BIPOC and 33% women, and our executive director, me, is white and identifies as a woman. Solidarity statements aren't enough anymore. With humility and respect to the work ahead, we have taken the following steps at ACE. We adopted our first ever board diversity plan by vote last October with specific commitments that are time-bound to bring more racial and gender diversity to our board of directors. All of our staff and board members, as of this year, are engaging in a 6-hour racial justice training series led annually by Equity Paradigm. We recently embarked on a year-long journey with Equity Paradigm to both assess and address the colonial systems and traits of white supremacy culture that impact our internal and external work. They are a North Carolina-based consultancy with expertise in diversity, equity, inclusion work, and racial justice training. And finally, we compensate all of the young people who are involved in our programs, including our organizing training program, the Action Fellowship. We're also applying a long-term mindset. We aren't interested in fast solutions or checking the box. We acknowledge and accept the enormous challenge ahead of us. Newly, we are seeking expertise to help us explore the creation of a fund overseen by young people for young people to support BIPOC youth climate activists directly in their work and at the funding levels that they deserve and that are going to advance the goals of their work. We acknowledge that we're on this journey together, and we are so deeply moved by the attendance at today's event with more than 175 of our individual donors, institutional funders, and others in our broader philanthropic community. Thank you. So joining our discussion today is Edgar Villanueva, a nationally recognized expert on social justice philanthropy. You may know him as the author of the book, Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. He's currently chair of the board of directors of Native Americans in Philanthropy, and he's a board member of the Andrus Family Fund, a national foundation that's working to improve the outcomes for vulnerable young people. In addition to working in the philanthropic sector for many years, he has consulted many nonprofit organizations and national and global philanthropies on advancing racial equity inside their institutions and also through the way that they invest. Edgar is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, and he is currently located in Brooklyn, New York, on the occupied land of the Lenape people. A couple of quotes from Decolonizing Wealth. Here's one from Heather McGee at Demos. By anchoring the solutions to America's ills in the wisdom and knowledge of its original people, Edgar challenges all of us to analyze how our nation's history of racism and disenfranchisement has infected its financial and giving institutions. And here's another. Edgar has broken through the tired jargon of philanthropy speak and written a fresh, honest, painful, and hopeful book grounded in his own truths and native traditions. Here's Edgar in his own words.
Most people get into the field of philanthropy because they want to see change, but how far are we willing to go to change things to a point that it's not in service of our own comfort? Often philanthropy is focused on looking forward, but there's so much in our own history that we don't actually address that I think is limiting us from being able to use resources in a way that is equitable for all communities. We need to take a look back at our history, a long stare in the mirror to understand how is my leadership showing up in ways that may not be inclusive unintentionally most of the times. How might I be perpetuating harm? We exist with all of these contradictions, but if we're at least honest, we're going to be in a much better position to have a real authentic conversation about equity. We have to understand that the work of equity is just messy. And when we think about what we're watching and what we're reading and the dominant narratives around race that we take in every single day, it's not a quick fix. It's intentional work that we have to do every single day, and we are going to make mistakes. But as people are growing and learning, we just all could stand to be a little bit more patient and gracious toward one another. Many funders, we have a lot of power. We are esteemed as experts. Our jokes are super funny to everyone. We're a lot better looking than the average person. Those are privileges of this work that become intoxicating. And I think that we become accustomed to being the ones who always have a seat at the table. I often have said to folks that we should be pushing for change so hard that we become very unpopular at dinner parties, right? That people should feel a little nervous when you walk into the room. If we're not pushing for that type of change, then we're not doing enough.
Next in the conversation is Vic Barrett, a democracy organizer with Alliance for Climate Education based in Madison, Wisconsin. He's proud to get the opportunity to expand access to the vote to more young people. He originally became involved in activism in high school, becoming a member of Global Kids, an organization that focuses on leadership development with young people. And then he became a fellow with ACE and spoke at the COP21 UN Conference on Climate Change in Paris at the age of 15. Barrett is also among 21 young people between the ages of 10 and 21 who are suing the federal government in the landmark lawsuit Juliana versus the United States for inaction on climate change. Vic is based in Madison, Wisconsin, on occupied land of the Ho-Chunk and Kickapoo people. And here's a little bit about Vic in his own words.
Looking at the numbers coming in, oh God, Australia had 300,000 people. Apparently Germany had 1.4 mil on its own. So this crowd might be actually huge.
Vic Barrett is a 20-year-old climate activist from White Plains, New York. Please welcome Vic to the stage.
Starting on this day, September 20th, 2019, everything began to change. My mother left the coast of Honduras, a place battered by storms and sea level rise, to find opportunity in New York City, the city of immigrants. I wonder how many people trying to find refuge here knew that because of the amount of money in their bank account or the color of their skin, they'd be placed on the front lines of disasters like Hurricane Sandy. Sandy, Maria, Irma, Dorian. This crisis follows people. My name is Vic Barrett. I'm 20 years old, and I'm one of the 21 youth plaintiffs in the Juliana versus United States constitutional lawsuit, suing the executive branch of the federal government for knowingly causing climate change, irreversibly threatening our health, our personal security, our homes, and our communities by recreating a dangerous climate system. Like youth who have come before us in the civil rights movement and other social justice movements, it is often the youth that must shine a light on systems of injustice.
And the final participant in our conversation today, and who will be moderating the discussion in just a moment, is Alexis Raeana Jones. Alexis is ACE's Eastern youth organizer based in southeastern North Carolina. She works to educate and empower young people to take action on climate change through civic engagement and advocacy. She's also an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. She has previously held the title of Miss Lumbee and has taken part and led Indigenous youth education initiatives. And finally, she's also a professional singer who was recently featured on American Idol, where she got the golden ticket to Hollywood. She's located in Pembroke, North Carolina on Lumbee territory. And here's a little bit more about Alexis.
We are the people of the dark water. We are an amalgamation of different tribes that settled in Robeson County. We had to come together to stay alive. I could talk about the Lumbee all day.
Could you talk about the connectedness to the land of the Lumbee people? I mean, it's eons and eons, generations and generations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I speak for not just Lumbee people, all Indigenous people when I say that we're mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically connected to the land. My people have always been here. God, I wish my mama was out here. If you look behind us, deep into the woods, you'll see like an old abandoned building. And that was a cucumber shed. I come from a history of sharecroppers, and that's what a lot of people did down here in Robeson County, a lot of Indian sharecrops. And this was a cucumber field. So everybody, my mom and her sisters, and they all picked cucumbers, and everybody brought their cucumbers here to get them pulled.
70% of children in Robeson County are living under the poverty line.
Absolutely.
And all across this county, you'll find these big corporate chicken farms that are polluting, the soil and the water. There's alarmingly high rates of cancer, and there's children's classrooms are infested with insects. It's almost like indigenous tribal land has no protections against poverty and exploitation. Why is that?
Absolutely, because main thing, greed, putting profit over people. From the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations, to different pipelines that want to come in the area, different emissions and the climate injustice that we're going through right now. The issues that our people are facing today is a continuation of genocide.
So that will be the three people joining in conversation to follow. In just a moment, I'll be passing the mic over to Alexis to facilitate and moderate the discussion. And I encourage all of the attendees, if you have a question that you would like us to weave into the interactive portion toward the end of the conversation, please feel free to chat that in. The chat can be seen by the panelists, and we have somebody behind the scenes who will be culling questions and weaving them into the conversation later in the program. Already seeing a lot of love for our panelists. Thank you for that. And we're so deeply grateful that you decided to spend the hour with us today. So with that, I will be passing the mic over to Alexis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Leah. And I would like to thank our audience for joining the Alliance for Climate Education's Equitable Philanthropy, a conversation with Edgar Villanueva, as well as ACE's very own Vic Barrett. And with that being said, Edgar, Vic, shall we begin?
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go.
Awesome. Edgar, it is amazing to speak with you today. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started with you. First question. There seems to be this unconscious white cultural assimilation in philanthropy. How do you relate to that while identifying as both Native American and Southern?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I have to say, Alexis, your video took me back because I've actually picked cucumbers myself. So I think working in cucumber fields as a young person really motivated me to work harder in school because I knew that could not be my path forever. But thanks for having me here. And this question is so important because I think that what most folks don't know is there is a pervasive white dominant culture that just exists in this country. For most of us, it's just like the air that we breathe, the water that we swim in, it's all around us. And we have not been exposed to a different way of life. And so the norm in this country is white culture. We internalize messages from the media. The people who decide what books are used in schools, the people who teach mostly in schools, the people who control the airwaves, the people who control the flow of resources, the majority of those folks happen to be white. And so for those of us who don't come from that community or that culture, we've learned to code switch in and out when we have to, while trying our very best to preserve the culture that we have. And being from North Carolina, like Alexis and I we have been exposed to whiteness for a long, long time. And so I celebrate our community in North Carolina and the fact that we still have such a resilient, strong Indigenous presence there after hundreds of years of colonization. For me, as a Native person and a person that's from the South, I do feel like these are two narratives that I have to push back on and explain and clarify and demystify for folks all the time. I remember when I was working in North Carolina in philanthropy, philanthropic colleagues from New York and other places sometimes would call upon me and to ask me questions about the South. And I remember one big foundation was wanting to move more resources in the South, and they flew me to New York and they said, Edgar, tell us everything about the South. Tell us what books we need to read. It was like this magical place that was like, not even a part of this country or something. And, so that's, I think there is a pervasive mindset nationally in the philanthropic sector that the South does not have capacity for whatever reason, that we are not a worthwhile investment. We've had to, just like we advocate to get money to people of color, the South is a region that we have to lift up all the time and push for resources and investment. And what is true about the South is that You cannot influence policy change or anything sweeping in the U.S. without the South leading the way. And, you know, as the South goes, as they say, is a saying for a reason. Regressive policies, harmful and you know, attacks on equity and justice are tested in the South first, right? And then rolled out nationally. So it behooves any funder to actually prioritize the South and understand the leadership in the South and that we've had historically around issues of civil rights and human rights, but also knowing that it will probably, in my opinion, be the South that actually leads us out of this mess. And then the other thing, of course, with Native American, being Native American, I think a lot of any person of color could identify in a lot of ways with what I've experienced. When we come into sectors like philanthropy, for example, that is white dominant, where 92% of foundation CEOs are white, 89% of boards are white, there's often this feeling that, wow, we were hired for our lived experience. We were hired because we were different. But when we get inside these institutions, there is this forced assimilation for us to, you know, be something else. And it's this conflict that we have to hold. I felt early on in my experience in philanthropy that I was actually being punished for being the thing that I was hired for. And I remember one day very specifically in a meeting at work where I was asked, which side are you on? And it's as if we have to pick, either you're on the side of community and that's where you're accountable, or you're with us over here where your responsibility is around preserving the legacy of this institution and the legacy of this wealthy family. And so I think that this is a challenge that we have to address in philanthropy when we seek to diversify and bring those marginalized populations into this space. We must not tokenize them. We must not think just in terms of surface diversity, which is just about you know, bringing in different folks, but refusing to address the deeper shifts in culture and dismantling white dominant culture that exists in our organizations, so that we as people of color, Indigenous folks, can come into these places and actually lead and thrive in our leadership.
Wow, powerful words, Edgar. Thank you for that. And I'm glad you touched base on being a Southeastern Native American. It seems like our people, Indigenous people of the East Coast, it sounds like we've been dealing with assimilation for over 500 years, and some of the things that our people have been dealing with since the beginning of colonization, we're still dealing with those issues now within philanthropy. So thank you so much for that. Very powerful. I'm so glad that we have you here, and we're going to hear from you some more and a few questions. Vic, how are you?
It's good.
Good seeing you. So my first question for you is, what advice would you give to white allies, funders, and philanthropists who want to be a force for good in the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that off top, I would definitely encourage that, you know, no matter what, or no matter how much you think you're already doing or considering about BIPOC people in your work, there's always more that can be done, especially if you're a white individual or if you're a part of a predominantly white organization. The lived experience of BIPOC people is inherently different than white people in many ways. And so that means you need to be willing to create or adopt creative tactics that might be outside of your usual comfort zone. And that's not a bad thing. I think also being willing to consult people of color about the change, about the differences you want to make, about what the plans that you're trying to implement is important, because especially if they're meant to reach communities of color, they're going to know how to best do that. And also you have to be willing to pay them for that work. And I would say that, like, bottom line, listening is key. It's easy to lose track of the space you occupy. I think a lot of organizations and places find that they might be consistently struggling to answer the needs of the BIPOC community, or consistently trying to figure out how to diversify their organizations. And it may be worth evaluating, like, how well you've actually sat back and really listened to the people that you intend to support, if you find that you're, like, kind of symptomatically having an issue with supporting those people.
Wow, thank you so much, Vic, for that insight. I'm looking in the chat. I already see some questions coming in. That's awesome. For one question that I've seen from Sabrina, and either Vic or Edgar, you can touch base on this if you'd like. Sabrina said, for organizations who think their work is at the nexus of climate change and poverty, what are 3 things they must consider, either global or domestic? Thank you for that question, Sabrina.
Vic, I think you should take this one.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, it kind of ties into sort of what I was just saying about, if you feel like your work is at the nexus of climate change and poverty, if you feel like your work is at the nexus of climate change and racial justice issues or any of these things, you really need to be making sure that you're considering the communities that you're trying to reach out to. You need to really make sure that you're actively listening to them and considering what their lived experience is and how it's different from yours, and make sure you're considering that and how you're planning to do that work. And yeah, I think that that's generally what I would keep in mind.
Thank you, Vic. And thank you, Sabrina, for asking that question. Awesome questions. And also keep them coming in, you guys. We see some awesome questions in the chat. Moving on to Edgar. And this is actually one of my favorite questions I've been looking forward to ask. Some may say your platform or framework of decolonizing wealth is radical. Would you consider yourself a radical voice in philanthropy? And if so, could you speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I actually did receive an award in January 2019 where I was named the most radical critic of philanthropy. And, part of me felt kind of proud. I was like, wow, I'm getting acknowledged as someone who is kind of unapologetically speaking truth to power. But then I also felt sad about that at the same time, because if being radical is just telling my story of what it's like to be a person of color working in philanthropy, if being radical is really about trying to push our sector of philanthropy back to a place where we center humanity and human relationships and love. Philanthropy literally means love of people. If speaking the truth is radical, then that's actually something that is quite disappointing. When I received that award or that label, I actually looked up the word radical, and I was reminded that radical actually means kind of getting back to the roots. And so, what I'm trying to do in my work with philanthropy is take us back to understand the origins of this sector, to understand how wealth has been accumulated in this country through colonization, through, slavery, through land grabbing and theft, to really understand that and take ownership of that history so that we can begin to use our resources in a different way to begin to repair that, right? It's also thinking about how do we shift from a charity model of sprinkling dollars around for, Band-Aid approaches around direct services and those types of things, which that type of work is absolutely important. But it's actually sad that we have a lack of a safety net in this country and that philanthropy is having to step in to fill those gaps. We need to be thinking strategically as philanthropists to invest in the root causes or radical causes of poverty. And when we think about that, for me, it's like, of course, getting at systemic racism and thinking about policy change and movement building and advocacy and building power in communities and supporting youth-led work so that we can get out of this mess in a way that funding direct services will never get us there. Poverty, I often say, is the product of public policy and theft. And as philanthropists, we have to acknowledge that there has been very intentional public policies through the years that have oppressed people of color, who have kept us in poverty, who have kept us redlined from opportunities. And those are the systemic issues that we need to be investing in. we also have to acknowledge that theft, right? That wealth has been in communities of color and it was extracted or taken away. So it's our responsibility to think more radically around how do we put that back? And then of course, all of this has been facilitated by the ideology of white supremacy. So we have to center racial justice in everything that we do as funders. So what I will say is that maybe when I started saying this stuff 2 years ago, it was quite radical, but I'm really excited to understand, you know, in my work in the past year and traveling all around the world and meeting with so many foundations and funders, people are really beginning to open up to these ideas. And there are actually funders who are using the framework in Decolonizing Wealth as their strategic planning documents and guides, who are doing trainings and conversations with their boards around decolonizing wealth. And even the most radical ideas that I put out in the book now seem a lot less radical because of the moment that we're living in. Foundations are really pushing beyond the rhetoric of you know, talking about diversity to think about how do we actually dip into our coffers, our endowments, and give money back to communities. How do we lead the way in a conversation about reparations? And so I feel like I'm in good company when I'm talking with funders, and the ideas seem less radical, as do a lot of the ideas from a couple years ago, right? Where we thought that certain things were impossible. We're seeing now in this moment, as systems are collapsing all around us, as climate change is becoming more and more real for us, as we see with these, with the pandemic and the economic fallout, even people who felt safe and comforted and from those realities are beginning to feel the pain and the hurt of what's happening in this country. So I think there's a push forward for all of us to think about something new and different, and we cannot go back to how things were before this pandemic. So I don't feel that I'm out here by myself as a radical person, but I do think that there's a movement for something different and radical and more transformative than what we've had in the past.
Thank you so much, Edgar, for that. And I guess for myself, if the movement calls to call out that systematic racism that some of our foundations have been based on, then you can call me radical, and I think we should all be radical.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Vic, what changes do you see are needed for the climate movement and philanthropy to fully embrace and support marginalized communities?
Yeah, I think to me that the way that we approach the intersections of climate change and racial justice and the impacts it has on marginalized communities just need to fundamentally change. We can't really just keep pointing to environmental racism as the single example of how these things intersect, and we need to be willing as a movement to address how white supremacy and the patriarchy and extractive capitalism all harm the planet, and they harm Black people and they harm Indigenous people, and doing the work within yourself and within your organizations to dismantle those systems is key to embracing marginalized people holistically, especially in the climate movement. And we need to understand that doing work to, you know, dismantle the police system or defund the police isn't that much more radical or different than divesting from fossil fuels per se. But for some reason, one is more digestible to people. And as long as it's helping to fight climate change and the way it negatively impacts the people on the ground, and as long as it's dismantling these systems that have historically oppressed people and discriminated against people and have extracted from the environment, that's important work, and that they intersect in way more complex ways than maybe just one that's easy to point to.
Well said, Vic. Well said, Vic. Well said. Thank you for that. Now we're going to move to the chat and see if there's some questions. I have seen some great ones pop up over the last 5 minutes. We have a question from Megan, and Megan's question is for Edgar. Megan says, what advice do you have to avoid complacency in a philanthropic career? When you are making a salary, of your dreams and treated like the most important person in the room, what advice do you have to keep your feet on the ground and your heart with the people who are actually the most important? And I think you spoke a little bit about that in your book, Edgar. Can you touch base on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I get asked all the time, how do you stay grounded? How do you stay connected to community? As if I no longer am attached to community at all. Honey, if you ever pick cucumbers in your life, then I am still the community. I'm doing a little bit better today. I'm not picking cucumbers, but you know, I'm sitting here as someone who, you know, is the first to graduate from high school in my family. I am deeply impacted daily by poverty and housing insecurity in my family, and helping people get out of jail and family members who are incarcerated. So being the person who has sort of escaped that in my personal life, I'm very deeply connected to my family, who is still experiencing all types of hardship because of the generations of trauma and poverty. But I will say that, you know, and I shared these stories in the book, that when I got into philanthropy, and which is a very privileged space, and I was able to buy a car that didn't break down every 3 blocks or backfire at the stoplight and scare everybody. You know, it can get quite comfortable, and I know it's a reality that especially people of color often hold as you get into positions of power and authority in your sector. You know, we begin to feel like, well, I have a mortgage, so how far do I push because I need this job? Those are real tensions that I've had even this week with CEOs of foundations who are like, I believe that Black Lives Matter, but I can, I can't push for it so much within this institution. My response to that is that we have to, in every single way, maintain some level of accountability, not just for those of us in philanthropy, but activists, organizers, people, nonprofit leaders. We all can easily become the darlings for a minute, or in the spotlight for a minute, and we can lose our minds. If you're not from a history of having power and influence in your life, when you get a taste of it, you can become a little bit disillusioned by that at times if you're not held accountable. In my life, I have intentionally put people there who will call me out, who will say, Edgar, I think you're getting too puffed up, who will pull me to the side and say, hey, we saw that you tweeted something that seemed very self-serving. And just to keep that in check, to make sure that I'm not getting, as we say down south, too big for my britches. That my intentions and everything that I do are really pure and really trying to make a difference in my community, and not trying to perpetuate my own way of leading that comes about by pushing others down. My Indian name that was given to me from an Ojibwe medicine man is Nagani Benishe, and that name means leading bird. And when he gave me that name, I actually had this immediate thought, what does that mean? Am I like the eagle that's up here soaring above everyone else, and I'm like, that person that is, exalted in that way? Because that was, on one hand, that seems awesome, right? But on the other hand, it's like, I don't want to be that person that leaves my community behind, that is up there flying solo. And what I came to learn is that what my name actually means is leading bird is the birds that fly in V formation. And if you don't have people flying behind you, in formation with you, if you don't have a base of support behind you, accountability and community, then you're just out deceiving yourself. And so we have to decolonize our leadership and refuse to lead in ways that are harmful to ourselves and to our communities. I think that we have to think about how are we constantly making room for the brilliance of other people? How do we share the mic and the stage and the platform with others? And, it's a process. It's especially in philanthropy, this is a field where this game is rigged and people want to put us on a pedestal, and they want to you know, cater to us in different ways. And we have to just really not allow that to get to our heads, because this is not about us. And ultimately, if you're not the person that is holding the bag of money and it's in your name, then you are replaceable by these institutions. And so we are all, you know, in leadership positions as stewards of power, as stewards of resources. And it just has to be about community at all times and not about ourselves.
Thank you, Edgar, for reminding us it's not always about ourselves. Like you said, it's about community, and that's why we are in the work that we do now. Thank you for these questions, you guys. Awesome. I think we can do one more. Let's see. From Michael. As a white fundraiser in a white dominant organization, how can we be sincere about sharing our BIPOC volunteers' stories and successes, but without tokenizing them when approaching funders? Thank you for that, Michael.
Vic, do you want to start with a response to that? Do you have?
Yeah, I can. I can start with that one. Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think that the key to it is definitely the sincerity and, you know, the people in your organization, the people of color in your organization that you're willing to highlight. Really, it's about that interpersonal conversation that you have with them. I've definitely experienced like going onto the websites of organizations I've worked with briefly or in the past, and like seeing me front and center on their website and being like, okay, that's interesting. And maybe if it was something that, you know, I had like given an okay on, or maybe even somebody had checked in with me on, or if even like, you know, that was an organization I was close to and had a really close relationship to, it would have been sincere and then it would have been fine. But I think it really is about checking in with the people in your organization that you want to uplift and you want to highlight, because, you know, that's great. But making sure that you're not doing it in sort of a sketchy way, that you're actually having a full, wholehearted conversation with them as a person that you're wanting to highlight, and not just as a person of color that you're wanting to highlight. Yeah.
Thank you, Vic. I felt that. I was there for you. I was there with you for a second there. That was awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Let's move on to some questions for both Edgar and Vic. Edgar, do you think it's possible for philanthropy, which comes from a capitalist system, to support the fundamental and profound changes necessary to create a racially just and equitable society?
Whew, this is a deep question. You know, I often think and speak in the concepts of both and. I think it's a very indigenous way to be, and because life is full of contradictions and it's just complicated, and it's actually white dominant thinking to think in ways of either or. When it comes to capitalism, this is what I will say. It's really challenging for me to imagine a different system, because we never have had it. The only system that I can imagine is prior to colonization in indigenous communities, the way that I have been told and have read, you know, about the ways that we took care of each other and the way that we, you know, had our own economic kind of systems of trading and making sure that everybody had what they needed and more than enough. In the US, our economic system and capitalism was founded off of slavery and, you know, of course, genocide and the stealing of land, but slavery was the industry that launched the economic system in the US. And anti-Black racism and extraction and commodifying the bodies of people is so baked into our economic system. I can't imagine a way possible to separate all of that from our system. Malcolm X said you can't have capitalism without racism, and I believe that. Now, philanthropy is obviously a byproduct of capitalism. We exist, these foundations exist because someone got rich and had so much money, they were able to create a foundation and then got a huge tax break and probably got so much more money because of that, right? No one has ever become poor by starting a foundation. There's a tax incentive to do so. I think that we have to, as a sector, grapple with that reality that the wealth that sits in the coffers of our institutions was made on the backs of Black folks, Indigenous folks, and people of color. And that is a fact. And I don't care if your wealth is new and you're like, oh my, someone created an app and that's where the wealth came from. There is still a system that has privileged folks to be able to be in a position to create these companies and to generate that wealth. So it's something that we have to take into account. People are able to be rich because other people are poor. And it is a broken system that is wrought with racism. Now, my approach to this work, because I'm not an economist and I don't know how to give you the answer for a new type of economic system other than get back to these original instructions that have been passed down to us and of course, centering the planet and people. And as you said, Alexis, in your video segment that, right, you can't put greed over people. What I know we can do in the meantime, as we're on the way to that new imperfect world, is like think about a harm reduction strategy. In the system that we currently have, and in the space of philanthropy, where folks on this call have power and resources at their disposal to do something different, we can do so much more to fight racism. The fact that only 8.5% of funding has gone to, that's the biggest year that we've ever had in terms of the money going to communities of color. The fact that we have still not hit 1% of grant funding for Native communities is an injustice. We have failed as a sector. We should feel ashamed and like get out of bed every single day to try to figure out what we need to do until this changes. When we account for the history of colonization and slavery and genocide and extraction and the harming of this planet, especially in communities of color, in order to accumulate wealth, and then understand that our communities, Indigenous and Black and BIPOC communities, are not benefiting from that bounty, something is wrong. And we absolutely can be a part of using these resources in a different way. We can pilot and think about funding reparations programs. We can go beyond the grant making and tap into our endowments and figure out ways to redistribute that wealth and power into communities of color, where we get out of the way and allow organizations led by people of color to use those resources in a self-determined way. And so that is a both and, right? Like we need a new system that is not extractive and harmful and divisive and racist. But in the meantime, there's so much more we can do with the resources that we have at our disposal to advance racial justice.
Wow, Edgar, so much to unpack in that response. Thank you. And Vic, I'm going to ask you the same question. Again, do you think it's possible for philanthropy, which comes from a capitalist system, to support the fundamental and profound changes necessary to create a racially just and equitable society?
Yeah, I think that what this question sort of makes me think, is like, I'm not necessarily an expert on philanthropy, as in like I've never worked in the field or like worked in its inner workings, but I've definitely been, a young activist and a young person of color in meetings with a whole bunch of other young activists of color trying to figure out how to get funds for the awesome work that we want to do. And I think that if you uphold sort of the fundamentals of what I understand philanthropy to be, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to create a more equitable society. It's just a fact that wealth in this country needs to be redistributed. It's just a fact that there needs to be more investment in grassroots solutions and ideas. And the money is there. It just feels like, some of those systems of oppression that I talked about before, like white supremacy and patriarchy and extractive capitalism, are like kind of dangling it above a lot of people who want to make a lot of changes heads. And I think that philanthropy could be a key part of the profound change that we need to make. It could be a huge driver of the profound change that we need to make. But I think that it's up to the change that philanthropy as a culture and as a business is willing to make. because no matter what, there's a bunch of inspired, like fired up young people all over this country and all over this world that would love to have more support in building the future that they want for themselves.
Thank you so much, Vic, for that. Thank you. I can't express again how grateful we are to have you both, Vic and Edgar, on this call. And I'm going to move to the chat. We have some questions in the chat. We still have some time for some discussion, and it's been great discussion. I hope everyone is enjoying this as much as I am. We have a question from Tecumseh, and this is for Edgar. Edgar, is there any specific trainings that you suggest funders take to make a better understanding of how to work with Indigenous and marginalized groups?
Yeah, I want to go call me. We have actually a workshop with Decolonizing Wealth Project, which is an organization I launched after the book to respond to this very question, because of course, everyone in philanthropy read the book. If you haven't, shame on you. We'll give you some time to catch up. But the next question that came back was, how do we actually do this? Because the book is a framework, ideas, and folks really are trying to get back to work and understand how to operationalize decolonizing wealth in the work day to day. So we do have a workshop, and of course, COVID had put that on pause for us, and I'm in the process of converting the workshop to a online format for funders. So please reach out, decolonizingwealth.com, and we're more than happy to share. There are also just several other resources groups that are doing amazing work to help funders understand how to operationalize racial equity in their work. The Philanthropic Initiative on Racial Equity is a great resource. Justice Funders is one of my partners, and I really appreciate everything that they're putting out to support a just transition from harmful philanthropy to philanthropy that is in support of communities of color. So lots of resources, but definitely hit me up and I can help connect you to some of that work.
Thank you, Edgar. And I think we have time for both Edgar and Vic to have one more rapid fire round question. And this question comes from Peter out of the Q&A in the chat. Could you share with the audience specific examples of organizational changes that are needed to activate decolonization of organizations? How do organizations start?
You want to start, Vic?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I would say that to me, what first comes to mind is education. And I guess a little bit of, I don't know what the word would, a little re-education. I was going to say uneducation, but I don't think that would make much sense. But basically just unlearning, I think, a lot of the things that you might, that like this white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist culture is kind of imposed on us. A lot of unlearning of those things that can happen through reading. There's so many resources on anti-colonial books that you can read if you want to start reading groups in your own organization, things like that. It might not seem like hard, tangible change, like maybe paying for a consultant or a training, but honestly, starting some of those internal conversations in your organization are so important to even being able to make those later actions fruitful in the first place.
Absolutely. I would add to that one, we have to make, excuse me, we have to make a lifelong commitment to this stuff, y'all. Like, this is not, the latest fad in philanthropy where I'm gonna come into your organization with a checklist and we're gonna fix these 5 things and we're gonna be good. We are unlearning, undoing, healing ourselves from hundreds of years of oppression. And so it is work that we have to commit to for a lifetime. I think it starts personal. I say to funders all the time, if the only time you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion is at work in a 30-minute training, then you're never going to get there. This does start, as Vic said, with reading and doing the work on yourself. If you are personally transformed and aware about your racial identity and how that intersects and overlays with the history of race in the US, then you are, and you're able to have these conversations with your families, it's going to show up at work. Like, you're going to just start making the right decisions and being able to identify sort of white dominant culture aspects in your organization to do the right thing. But we can't separate the head from the heart. This can't be an academic exercise where it's just training after training after training without having some type of personal transformation. And I can speak from personal experience, y'all. I mean, I was raised to be racist. I was raised to be homophobic. I was raised to be all kinds of things that I have had to unlearn my entire life. And even though I am completely enlightened now, because of the world that we live in and the messages I internalize and receive from everywhere, every now and then I still think something that's crazy. And I'm like, where did that come from? So it's a daily practice to decolonize our thinking. I had a friend who once described it like this, is that every single day that we wake up, there's a pill in our mouth. And we have to make a conscious choice to either swallow that pill or spit it out. And that pill is like, you know, white dominant thinking, white supremacy thinking. And I don't mean the KKK and those, you know, crazy folks over there. I mean just like everyday, like dominant cultural norms that are harmful and awfully unintentional, right? Like a lot of, I believe that people who work in philanthropy are good people who really want to do the right thing. You're not out to hurt communities of color. Often when people hear that only 8.5% of funding goes to communities of color, people are like, oh my God, I didn't even know that, right? So it's just there, it's unintentional, but we have to be like proactive about spitting it out. Like not today, like it's got to go. And when we have those thoughts that pop up in our mind, those choice points every day in our job, like, do I hire this person or that person? Do I choose this vendor or that vendor? I'm constantly trying to think about how can I advance racial equity in every decision that I'm making. And so commit to this work, do this work personally, and then, you know, get with your organization, your colleagues, and dedicate the time, the resources, and the space to like dig in, lean into the discomfort, and get the work done. And it can't be work that is on the side where you have a DEI person, often the person of color, that has to lead this work. This needs to be from the top down, bottom up, through your employee handbook, through your grant making. And we can't be paralyzed by thinking that we have to learn and become an expert or, you know, be perfectly knowledgeable about all of this stuff before we move money. You can move money today, and you can learn a lot about communities of color by funding them. And so while you're learning and doing the work, we, you know, also start funding now, because we don't have time. And frankly, if you're not a person of color, you'll never be an expert in our communities. So we want you to do the work. We want you to understand how white supremacy is harming you as a white person and is hurting your family. And what I invite funders to do is not get in relationship with me to, you know, support poor Indian people over here. Yes, we need your money and we want to support them, but it's actually offering you an invitation and a lifeline into your own liberation by doing this work, because we are all in this thing together. We all need to be healed. We all need to be liberated. And we got to act now. So let's do it.
Alexis, you are muted.
So powerful. Thank you so much, Edgar. Thank you everyone for coming together to discuss this awesome topic, equitable philanthropy. Thank you again, Vic and Edgar, and I will pass it on to Leah to close us out.
Thank you. In our final 60 seconds together, we wanted to talk about next steps. This has to be actionable. First and foremost, so deeply grateful and humbled by the conversation, Alexis, that you led, and Vic and Edgar for your participation, the overwhelming attendance from our funding community on this call. It is deeply moving. I acknowledge there are a lot of questions left unanswered in the chat. That's why we have the contact information up here for all of our speakers today. Thank you on behalf of our whole staff and board. Next, this is just the start of the conversation. I'm on my own journey exploring how my leadership and identity and ACE's positioning in the climate movement and broader movement for social justice might show up in ways that aren't inclusive or perpetuate systems that we have to break down together to build the equitable, just, and inclusive world that we want. For everyone on this call, your actions are these. If you haven't yet, catch up and read Decolonizing Wealth, Edgar's book. Also join Liberated Capital. If you have questions about what that is, that fund, please contact Edgar. And here's the contact information for Alexis, myself, and Vic as well. Thank you. I'm sure you all are busy and have to go to your next call, but just a huge, huge thank you to all of our participants today, all of our attendees from the whole ACE team and our board. Have a lovely and restful week. Bye-bye.